All right, so we know that this is the 25th anniversary of Young Life and Times, and I'm actually about to hit another anniversary, and so I asked Madeline earlier if she was going to be here. She does not know that I'm about to do this, and I'm about to hit my own anniversary. So about 10 years ago, it would be in January, I came to Belfast for the first time to do my interview. And I was coming, my background's family demography, my dissertation was looking at remarriage and the differences between white and Latinos. Spoiler alert, not many Latinos in Northern Ireland. So I'm coming here and doing my interview, and I'm really, as anyone who's done these interviews, you're having to kind of make links of how you fit and, how you can work, with the kind of research that's been done. And so in this kind of preparation, I'm about to hit the interview, I came across this brilliant article that Madeline had done, and I absolutely loved it. And so when I went for my interview, I was thrilled that she was part of the interview panel. And she probably doesn't remember it, it's 10 years ago. And so it was in the panel, and part of the things is, how are you going to do here? And I was like, oh wow, there's Madeline, and I just add this brilliant piece of line of research, and I'm going to build off of that. And it's taken me 10 years. So Madeline, just to let you know, I'm true to my word. I have finally built off of your research, and am looking at dating in Northern Ireland, and particularly kind of thinking a little bit about mixed relationships and what does it mean as far as dating across the different lines. So, okay, so why should we care about young people and their dating lives? And so within kind of a human development framework, a lot of the interest has been kind of thinking of this as an important developmental stage in people's lives. And so you have this idea that it can shape your self-identity. So who you think you are and things like that can be shaped by the relationships that you enter and build. In addition, it's people are interested in how it relates to your other relationships. So your peers, your friends, your family, and how that can kind of intersect as far as your dating relationships and things along those lines. Other kind of lines of research has looked into people's current well-being. So how, this idea that dating and relationships can sometimes be a very important aspect of people's daily lives and being an important part of their well-being. And it can also reflect and kind of influence a trajectory and the relationships that they form later in life and aspects around that. Now, the thing that I'm going to concentrate on is this last point, and this is something that demographers have often had interest within this, and this idea that when we look at intimate relationships, and particularly things such as partnerships and dating, it's this idea that it can give us indication about social barriers and social cohesion and kind of groups and idea. So the arguments behind this is that when we look at a divided society, you can look at these sort of things of how much people are mixing and interacting, can give us an indication of how divided are these two groups. And when we talk about dating and we talk about relationships, we're actually talking about some of the most intimate relationships that we have, which means that in some ways this can be the biggest barrier when we talk to divide. So people are much more likely to be willing to work with someone of a different community, or to have friends with someone of a different community. But when you get down into sort of relationships and kind of building a life with someone, that seems to be kind of the most intimate and therefore hardest one to kind of overcome these particular divides. So by looking into relationships, we can get a really clear indication of what are the groups, what are the divisions that we can kind of see, and how far have they kind of overcome. So going into that. So when we talk about these things, so the questions that we have in the Young Life and Time is really looking about, have you had a boyfriend or girlfriend, and what are kind of the characteristics of your boyfriend or girlfriend? Are they the same or different? So within this, we're really kind of capturing and looking at this in-group versus kind of out-group. So are you dating within your own group, or are you dating someone across groups? And when we look at dating and kind of on relationships and marriages and all of these sort of like personal kind of relationship things, what we find is that generally speaking, people tend to date or marry people who are like themselves. And it's something that we find everywhere. It's pretty quite common. And there are various reasons for this. This is this idea that sometimes these relationships actually have better success rates. So they're going to be less likely to divorce. And part of this is you have shared networks, and you have shared values, and you have similarities, or you don't come across as many challenges or barriers within your relationship as such as prejudice. So these relationships can be easier. In addition, it's this idea of who you know and kind of who in your networks. So the research that has been done that really looks on, what are kind of the biggest barriers of dating across different groups and lines, has been first off thinking about preference. So this is this idea of how interested are you in dating someone who is different than yourself? Now this could also be kind of indirect and direct. So you can talk about direct interest as in, how much, if I was a Protestant, how much willing am I to date someone who is Catholic? But it could also be kind of similarities in interest, right? So for instance, if you were really interested in Irish music and that was your hobby and that was your activity, you might come across more people who are Catholic than Protestant, right? So that's sort of an indirect way that, certain groups might have certain interests and characteristics, and those commonalities are what attract people together. The other aspect is third parties. So we're talking about third parties. It's particularly at this age, you'd be talking about peers or your family, right? And this idea, but you can also think of church leaders and general society, and this idea of how supportive or how unsupportive are these groups of people around you, encouraging or discouraging you from dating someone who is from a different group than yourself. And then the final one is opportunities to meet. So this is this idea that it is quite challenging to date someone that you have had no contact with. So this is idea of thinking about people's daily lives, where who are they interacting, and who they're interacting with can very much reflect who they end up dating, right? And so as far as the kind of various research that's been done, there hasn't really been done very much on this. When we look at marriages, so this is more for adults, we have a publication by Wright that was done in 2015 that looked at the 2001 to 2011 census, and this was specifically about marriages. And so what they found was 92% of married couples were from the same religion, right? So as you can see, so it's 8% or less had kind of varying religious groupings. Then we had Lloyd and Robinson. They used the Northern Ireland Life and Times, so the adults, and they looked at from 1998 and 2005, and they were looking at both religion and living together. And they found that 10% of people were dating or with someone of a different religion, so still kind of 90% in a different relationship group. Now, those are all adults. So one of the things to kind of keep in mind is when you're looking at these sort of barriers and crossing and things like that, there's interesting things that you can find when you're looking at younger people. So first off, if we're talking about the very big changes that have happened in Northern Ireland, we could really expect, if we're talking about the propensity to get in a relationship with someone of a different religion, if you're talking about those who are 70 in their 70s, they lived a very different context in life when they were getting together with their partners than 16-year-olds today, right? So it could be very much sort of expectations of change, if we could see if there's been a shift in society and kind of more welcoming and less division with younger people. In addition, when you're talking about dating, in some sense it goes back to that level of intimacy. When you're talking about dating, people tend to be more adventurous. So people are much more likely to date across lines than they are to marry across lines. So when we're talking about dating, we would expect to see more flexibility and more openness on who people meet, because it's less of a permanent kind of decision, and necessary, for instance, that the third parties and things, might not rev up as far as those sorts of things, or just the difficulties of dating someone who's different. It's easier to date someone and have that dissolve than marry. And so what we end up seeing is those who date are much more likely to have dated across group lines and say someone who's ended up in a marriage. So as far as I have one bit of qualitative stuff, which comes from Matter Than Unlimited 2009 article, of which I'm enamored with. And so just to give you some examples of that. She looked at 14 to 15-year-olds, and seeing kind of what their views are and what their ideas are, as kind of dating across lines. And so to give you some examples of kind of preference and third parties that came from that. So you have from a Protestant girl who was saying, my mommy might speak to me again, but my daddy definitely wouldn't, right? So this kind of emphasis that parents are kind of in people's minds as far as thinking, you know, what would be the consequences if they dated across the divide. And then another quote that was used and this is from a Catholic boy, is kind of relating a bit more towards, you know, the preferences on rather third party. And I was like, see, they would probably want their kids baptized their way, and like we would want it baptized our way. So kind of really seeing, kind of thinking through kind of the complications that could happen if you're dating across the line, and therefore kind of just preferring it to be the other way. So as far as the prevalence, there's nothing that we really know about the prevalence of this prior to this. This is the first time that I know it's really been asked. There was a 2019 article that was done with QUB students. So this was done in psychology, and so therefore probably most likely almost all psychology students. So a very kind of select group, if you can think of that. But within that group, they asked how often, you know, people had dated or, you know, across lines, and it was specifically asking Catholic and Protestant, so there's no information on this, on what people with no religion were saying. And among the Catholics and Protestants, 70% had never been in a relationship with an ARK group member. So that was 2018, and looking at QUB college students. So we can kind of see some evidence there, but nothing around 16-year-olds as far as prevalence. And none of these have really been able to kind of capture, although they've all kind of addressed this idea of opportunity. So that was one of the big things that we were able to look in the 2022 survey. So I'm going to go through that. All right, so first off, I just want to prep this with dating experiences and the fact that I'm going to kind of consider two groups to look at. I've looked at many other groups, but as far as for within a 30-minute presentation, I pulled up the two that I thought would be most interesting for the talk, and so we'll go to that. So first off, out of the whole sample, how many of you have ever had a boyfriend or girlfriend? And sorry, that is actually the wrong number. It should be, I think, much higher. It's 2,000, isn't it? Yeah, I forgot a 2. Sorry, it was more than 800. So as far as that, you have about 43% who's never had a boyfriend or girlfriend at the point of 16 when they're doing these interviews, whereas about a third said previously and about 21% currently. Now again, this is not a question that we know a lot about. The best I could do as far as comparatively is I found something from the Pew Research Center, which was looking at US data, and it was roughly similar with about 40% of people never having dated. And this was, I think, 2015 data, and we were talking about 15 to 17-year-olds. So kind of the same age, a little bit soon, but showing it's kind of roughly comparable to what we're seeing in the US. Okay, so I said I was going to look at two groups. So the first one I wanted to look at was looking at LGBTQ+, compared to non, and looking at the very differences of this, because there's some interesting differences to draw out from this. And so this is just generally those who have had date. And so what I've done here is I've stacked the previously on top and the previously is on bottom, and then the currently is on top. And so you can kind of just see the total here of those who have dated. So you can see here with the LGBTQ+, we have over 60% who have dated, and whereas with the non-LGBTQ+ group, we had over 50%, but not quite 60. So we can see that the LGBTQ+ are more likely to have dated, which can make sense in sense as far as one's identity and things along those lines. Okay, so then the other aspect that I really want to cover is looking at differences by religion. And so here we have no religions on top. Again, these are just the percent who have dated kind of previously or current stacked together. And so we can see that no religion has the highest percent of the religious categories showing about those who have dated. So over 60% of those with no religion have dated, whereas the lower group then would be Protestant, and then Catholics, the least amount of those who have dated, which is less than 55%. So not too much differences, but slight differences between those groups. Okay, so then to get to the crux of my question, I was interested in was dating across different backgrounds. And so this is this idea that not looking at, well, you'll see in a second, but this idea of the people, among those who had dated, what we did was ask them if they had dated someone who had a different characteristic than them. And so what we did here was look at a few different characteristics. So the top here is looking at different family backgrounds. So they were asked if they had dated someone of a different family. Actually, technically we asked them if they had the same, but I think it's more interesting to show across lines rather than similarity. So this is asking someone or showing those who have dated someone who came from a different family financial background. And then the next one is if they dated someone from a different ethnicity, someone with a different nationality, and someone with a different religion background identity. Okay, so what we can see here, and this is again comparing LGBTQ to those who are non. And what we can see is, so I have the top as the purple with the dots. I did do patterns in case you were colorblind. So the dots are at the top with the purple dots, LGBTQ+, and then the bottom bars next to that are the non-LGBTQ+. So the big thing that you can notice here is that LGBTQ+ are higher than the non-LGBTQ+ in every single category. So what this is really saying is that those who identify as an LGBTQ+ identity are more likely to date someone different than themselves on all of the categories that we looked at: financial background, ethnicity, nationality, and religion. And we can see here, and the other thing to kind of note here to see is that with even between these different groups, we can see various differences. So for instance, the area that people were most likely to date across identity lines with were backgrounds or finances. So people are most likely to date someone with a different financial background than them. And then we can see, for instance, ethnicity was the lowest as far as the different groups, and that might be partly explained by these demographics within Northern Ireland, and the fact that there's just not a huge amount of ethnicity variations or how people define it. And then you can see that nationality and religion were somewhat similar, but religion being slightly more than nationality in this case. Okay, so part of what I wanted to see is, so we see these differences, and we see that those who have an LGBTQ+ identity are much more likely to date across the lines, and I wanted to see, yes, there could be preferences involved with this, and yes, there could be aspects around third parties, but what I really wanted to gather was information about opportunities to meet, particularly when we think about the Northern Ireland society and how divided and segregated our kind of living spaces and social lives are. So one of the questions we were able to ask were, where did you meet your partner? So for this particular partner, either your current, if you don't have a current partner, your previous partner, where did you meet them? And giving kind of a sense of where people are meeting their significant others. So as far as here, you can see that the most common answer for both LGBTQ+ groups and the non-LGBTQ+ groups is at school. So not quite half, but close to half of people were meeting their boyfriends or girlfriends at school. And we can see it's actually slightly higher, although not really notably so, but slightly higher for the LGBTQ+ group than the non. But when we look at the next highest, we can see for the LGBTQ+, we can see the next highest group is social media, whereas that is not the next highest for the non-LGBTQ. The next highest for them was when you were out with friends or through friends. So there was a question about, did you meet people out when you're out with friends? And then in the other response, there was a few people who had mentioned specifically meeting their partners through a friend. So I've kind of combined those together as a kind of through friend group. But what we can see that's more common with that. And then when we think of this other, which were groups that were just too small to kind of put on their own, which included leisure clubs, neighborhood, church, etc. All of these were similarly the least likely, slightly more with non-LGBTQ. So within this, what I would say here is potentially part of what we're seeing is levels of accessibility and comfortability. So if we're talking about, for instance, the LGBTQ+, what we know from studies is that social media can be a very useful and powerful way to for these groups of people to meet in order to date. And so it is not terribly surprising that that group is higher than the other group as far as meeting through social media. But we also can see that that's tied with school as well, which might be in the sense level of contact and this ability that sometimes if you are LGBTQ+, sometimes what the research tells us is that there can be difficulties as far as approaching people and trying to sort of hit on or trying to start relationships with people you don't know because of that awkwardness of not necessarily knowing people's identity and things along those lines. So school might be a more opportunity place to meet because you would typically have longer running relationships with them than say meeting someone in town, or at a party if you were kind of out with friends. So that might really be kind of reflecting that situation. Okay, and then the other thing that I want to really emphasize, because this is again about the ability and what are the opportunities for people to meet. So you can see one of the most common places for people to meet at are schools. So if we're talking about dating between different groups, one of the things I really wanted to look at was religion because we have information about the religiosity or makeup within the school, and in addition, knowing that again the Northern Ireland context is highly segregated across religion. So one of the things I thought was quite interesting to see here, so in the group that you see most to the left, so just so in case you guys are following me, I know it's a lot of graphs, I love my graphs. So what we have here is all or nearly all one religion, and this is mostly one religion, about half and half, and don't know. So the group that's mostly towards the kind of right side is going to be the group that has the least amount of potential opportunities to meet someone who's from a different religion. Whereas about half and half would be more of a mixed school. So something to notice kind of here as well, keeping in mind that LGBTQ were most likely to date someone different on all categories, but including religion, is noticing that LGBTQ are much more likely to be in the kind of mixed schools that are about half Catholic and half Protestant, whereas the non-LGBTQ crowd, have, much more likely than the LGBTQ class to be in a school that is all or nearly all. Although notably, that's the highest amount for both groups, right? It's the idea that most people are attending schools that are all or nearly all one religion, more so than the others. But LGBTQ+ are in schools that tend to be more diverse for the minority that are doing that. Okay, so what are the causal explanations that we're seeing as far as LGBTQ+ more likely to date across the divide? So one aspect that's often looked at is this idea of a smaller dating pool. So when there's less people to date, you might have to have a wider range and more flexibility as far as who you're dating. This might encourage going to more diverse dating opportunities. So if you're in a smaller pool and it's more difficult to meet people, you might be more likely to again use social media. And social media is going to encourage dating someone who's not necessarily in a segregated school or segregated neighborhood as you. And we could see that LGBTQ+ people were more likely to attend mixed schools, more likely to do social media, and were essentially meeting people in potentially more diverse arenas. The other aspect is in part because of the smaller dating pool and other reasons, the LGBTQ+ identity can be a more silent identity than other ones. So we talked a little bit earlier about what's like the strongest identity to a young person. And when you're part of the LGBTQ+ community, a lot of times what you see is that's the most important identity. And that can supersede identities about religion or about nationality or about other aspects. And this idea of it can relate a bit to the importance of it in your life. And in addition, having a smaller dating pool, it cannot all interact with that. But this idea that it's more important and more aspect as far as connecting with other people based on your LGBTQ identity rather than someone's religious identity or nationality identity or so forth. The other aspect is you have this group of young people who essentially, if we think of kind of, heteronormology and things like that, you have young people who have already kind of broken some of the sense, kind of the social norms of society. And so this idea of breaking other kind of norms as far as dating across lines and things like that is, less of a big deal or kind of, a problem, for this group of people. And then the other aspect now, we all know in Northern Ireland, when we talk about religion, it's very complicated as far as how we define it. On one aspect, when we talk about, Catholic or Protestant, we're talking about a religion, but we're also talking about it as some form of ethnicity. And it's really difficult sometimes to tease that information out. And so one of the aspects is kind of, at least on the religion aspect, but we could see it kind of filtered through all of the other aspects, was this idea that, those who are identifying the LGBTQ plus community may be less likely to be attached to the idea of a Catholic or Protestant, kind of identity, and, rejecting that along with the idea of the rhetoric within these religions that have not necessarily been supportive and could be quite negative. And so this idea of part of that rejection is not being really attached to dating within one's own religious background. Okay, so then moving to the second part is then looking at the same information by religious group. So what we can see here is, so on the top we have no religion, and then we have that followed by Protestant in the middle as the yellow, and then the dotted purple at the bottom is Catholic. So one of the things that we can see as far as those who are most likely to date across lines are those who have identified themselves as no religion. And that can be quite notable in every single group. And there's a little variations between, if we're looking at Protestant and Catholics, of who are most likely to cross lines. Sometimes it's Catholics that are less, sometimes it's Protestants that are less. And so there's a little variations across that, but we can see that the no religion standing out as far as the different aspects from that. And I'll talk a little bit of why I think there might be some variations there. Okay, so then going to the next question of where people have met and what this might indicate. So again, school being a very popular place, the same group of people, just different characteristics that we're looking at, where people have met, school being the number one place as far as the order of where people are meeting. It was the highest among Protestants and the least among Catholics, but for everyone it was still the most common place for people to meet. And then we can see as far as other places, the kind of next is very similar with no religion, with social media or being out with friends, but kind of somewhat similarities across these different groups, although slight variations. And then if we go to the religious makeup of the school, again, noting that the majority of where people were meeting, so over 40% of everyone across the groups were meeting at school. What were the kind of variations across as far as the religious makeup of those schools? And what's really noticeable, as everyone can see here, is one of the most drastic differences that you see kind of in my graph is over here. And this is when you're looking at Catholics. So we have almost 70% of Catholics are attending all or nearly all one religion school, right? And it's very different than when you're looking at Protestants who, are more, and no religion, who are closer to a third, rather than well over half, almost 3/4. So a big difference there, and so you can kind of see the aspects here, and that follows with all of the other ones, and since Protestant and no religion are more likely to be in the mostly run religion and about kind of half group as well. So Catholics are being particularly concentrated in the schools that they're attending. Okay, so when we're talking about potentially differences across different groups and why we might see variations within these, we can definitely see there's a degree of division by religion, and we can see really noticeable differences that we can see in social spaces, and particularly when we're looking at Catholics, and Catholics are really attending, much more likely to be attending these schools that are nearly all one religion, and when that's where most people are meeting, it really kind of has a relationship there. The other aspect that's kind of interesting is when we talk about no religion. So we can see that no religion is more likely to date across lines for all the different groups. And this is quite interesting because a lot of the other research, in part because of the new aspects around no religion, has been really growing. And it's a growing proportion of our population. And these are the groups that are most willing to kind of date across all lines. And part of this could be the background. These could be people who are coming from, a non-Northern Ireland society, but really most likely it's people who are kind of moving away from, who are Protestant or Catholic, and moving away from that, those sort of identities and kind of taking more of a no religion identity. And again, this gets a bit tricky when we're talking about going to no religion, because on one aspect, you can still be Catholic or Protestant and not consider yourself religious, and keep ties to that based on your kind of ethnic identity, kind of attachment background to it. And so when you have people with no religion, it could be a kind of conscious sort of separation from that and not wanting to be a part of kind of these more culturally kind of cohesive, kind of separated groups, and making active kind of things to be separate from that. And that could be potentially sort of related to why then we're seeing these particular people much more likely to date across bounds. And then one of the interesting aspects, again, was why do we see Catholics in particular, less likely to date across religious divides, and being concentrated really highly in these religious schools. And so I think it's quite interesting, particularly since a lot of the information or research has been done about Catholics is this idea of being more accepting towards other minority groups and being more kind of willing, they're more pro-refugee, they're more, open to LGBTQ plus issues. And so you have this sort of aspect, but at the same time, what we're seeing is a little bit opposite in the sense that they're less likely to want to date across religions. And so I think it's kind of an interesting counter there. And I think part of what might be going on is a little bit of being within this kind of historically minor group. While you might be more open and accepting of other groups, it might be this change and this difference of having this intimate relationship. And what does it mean to be kind of having this group identity or kind of crossing that group identity? So while you might be a minority group who's quite welcoming of other groups, you might still be really within a particular group cohesion that's encouraging, whereas Protestants might be more of a diverse group, where even though there might be some Protestants who are very attached to Protestant identity and want to have a lot of in-dating, you might have a diverse kind of set of groups. And we can see that a little bit with Protestants more likely to be converting to no religion and, so forth. The kind of previous information we were talking about, there was less change with Irish identity versus, or Republicanism versus Unionist. So there might be more diversity going on there. But again, early stages. So. Okay, so as far as my conclusions, things to note is that most young people in Northern Ireland have dated by age 16. And what we see here is that one notable thing, I don't know if I really did, but really the only thing we saw was one particular group when we were talking about financial that even had a majority. The majority of 16-year-olds were dating, only a minority were dating people from different backgrounds. So when you're talking about across religion, across nationality, across ethnicity, even across financial background, what we saw is the majority of young people were dating people who were similar to themselves. So even though there's been a lot of changes that are happening and things like that, we definitely have not hit a panacea where people, are dating people wildly different than themselves. I talked a little bit about ethnicity and why that was quite low. That might be really strongly related to opportunity, but it is a little hard to tell because how are people defining ethnicity and things like that. And then what we could see is a low prevalence of partners with different nationality or religion, and this could really suggest that we still quite have a divided society occurring, and something that we're not seeing sort of a radical change with at this kind of upcoming cohort. And while I do think that preference and third parties are definitely part of the picture and explaining why we're seeing some of these divisions, I think the information really tells us that this opportunity to meet is definitely a part of the puzzle and really explaining a good reason of why we're not seeing more cross kind of dating across different groups. All right.
Thank you.